You're defending the institution of marriage. And I defend it because it's the bedrock of civilization, so it deserves defending. And I defend it because it's under constant attack, so it needs defending. And one of the most troubling developments in recent years, which we've discussed on this show in the past, is that these attacks are increasingly waged not just from the left, but from certain noisy segments of the right as well. Some right-wing influencers with legions of young, mostly male fans have decided that men should abandon marriage and family life and go their own way. And these influencers, many of whom consider themselves a part of the so-called red pill movement, pretend to despise feminists and yet have essentially arrived at the same conclusion as feminists, which is that we should give up on the family. The two sides hate marriage almost as much as they hate each other. Now, one of these influencers is a woman named Pearl Davis, who has garnered a relatively large following on YouTube and various social media platforms. She's in her mid-20s, single and childless, and yet full of opinions about modern marriage and family life, a subject that she has no personal insight into whatsoever. She spent the past few days on the internet complaining about quote-unquote trad cons like myself, who, she says, promote the nuclear family despite not understanding what it's really like. Yes, we men who actually have wives and children don't know what it's like to be married, but a woman who is not married and has no children does know what it's like. In one of her tweets, she wrote, quote, "The tradcons push marriage because they aren't old enough to know better. They don't know the reality of what they're pushing." This is accompanied by a picture of myself, Ben Shapiro, and Michael Knowles. We aren't old enough to know better and don't know the reality of what we're pushing, yet a woman who is younger than us and single does know better and does understand this reality. In other posts, she goes on to say that marriage is a terrible deal for men. And she later explains, quote, "Would you ever sign a contract that fails 75% of the time where your business partner is paid to break the contract? Why would you encourage men to sign that contract until the terms are fixed?" Now, you may be surprised to learn that marriages fail at a rate of 75%. The figure that people like this normally use is 50%. And the claim that 50% of marriages end in divorce is already spurious, and we'll have more on that in a moment, but 75%? I was wondering where that number came from, so I scrolled down and I saw something that she reposted from an alleged lawyer who said this, quote, "It's not 50-50. That only accounts for divorces. Another 25% on the negative side for miserable men trapped in cheaper to keep her marriages, unwilling to risk financial destruction and loss of their children. 75% chance of a devastatingly bad outcome is just a bad plan. No sane person would enter into a commercial contract on such terms." Now, I did ask him where he got this 75% figure from, and he wouldn't say. Apparently, the magic statistic fairy came and whispered it in his ear. Now, for her part, Pearl later tweeted a picture of Pierce Brosnan with his wife of 20 years, and she questioned whether the marriage counts as successful since Brosnan's wife has put on some weight at the age of 60. So apparently, even if they're happy and have remained married for 2 decades, they still might fall into that 75% failure rate because they have not both remained in supermodel condition into their 60s. This debate on social media brought out the rest of the marriage skeptical crowd on the right. A bunch of these red pill influencers decided to hop on an emergency Zoom call and spend 2 hours talking about me and the rest of the Daily Wire crew and our reckless promotion of society's most fundamental institution. Now, there's one clip here that you should see. This is apparently a divorce lawyer who says that the failure rate for marriage is not 50% and it's not 75%. It is, in fact, even higher. Listen.
I think marriage can be successful, of course. It's just not something that's as scalable as we as a society are trying to pretend it is. Marriage is, and I've said this 100 times and I'll say it 100 more, marriage is like the lottery. You are probably not going to win. Okay? You're probably not going to win. Don't make that your 401k. You're probably not going to win. But if you win, what you win is so great that I don't blame you for buying a ticket and trying. I personally don't buy lottery tickets. But when somebody says, yeah, I played the lottery, hey man, somebody's got to win. And you know what? As long as you're not blowing money that you need for food or to put shoes on your kids' feet, you're not hurting anybody. Go out, give it a try. So I always tell people, listen, marriage, when it works, when you have somebody who's married 20 plus years and they're still crazy about each other, that is the exception, not the rule. But when you do it, it's phenomenal. It's phenomenal. So why not buy the ticket, take the ride, but have a prenup? Wear a seatbelt, guys. You can be a safe driver, but wear a seatbelt.
So a happy marriage, he says, is like winning the lottery. And the thing about the lottery is that almost everybody loses. This is a perfect summation of how this entire club views marriage and the message that they're sending to young men in particular. Sure, it can be great, they concede, but only if you're insanely lucky. Everybody else is screwed. This is a rather bleak view of marriage, and thankfully, it's also nonsense. First of all, the claim that marriage isn't scalable is obviously ridiculous because marriage has served as the bedrock of human society since time immemorial. It has already happened at the scale of civilization for thousands of years. Now, the divorce lawyers come along and say that, this thing that society's been doing forever, turns out it doesn't work. Unless you're the one in a million. It's ridiculous. It's a ridiculous claim. Now, what about the failure rate of marriages in our culture? We've heard 50%, we've heard 75%. We just heard that they fail at a rate similar to the rate that people lose the lottery, which would mean higher than 99%, a lot higher. Yet, these kinds of astronomical odds are not based in anything but the doom and gloom speculations of the people inventing them. There is no evidence that having a happy marriage is as unlikely as winning the lottery, or that 75% of marriages end in misery. And what about the 50% number? Well, this is at least is a familiar statistic. It's something that you've probably heard before. 50% of marriages end in divorce. It's familiar, but it is bogus. And one way you know that it's bogus is that people have been claiming that 50% of marriages end in divorce since I was a kid. I've been hearing that my whole life. And that would mean that divorce rates are static across time. But of course, that isn't the case. In fact, we know that divorce rates have gone down in recent years. So where does the 50% figure come from? Apparently, it's a holdover from the 1980s, which is when people first started citing that statistic. It's not true today. And it's actually not clear that it was true even in the 80s either. So what is the actual divorce rate? It's a little bit hard to determine. Probably our best guess is based on U.S. Census data, which according to the most recent figures, says that about 35% of American adults who have been married have been divorced. So it's not exactly going to give us a precisely scientific figure of what the divorce rate is, but it's as close as we're going to get, 35%. And 35% is high. I mean, it's way too high. It's not 50% though. And it's not 75%, and it's not 99%. And it's definitely not lottery odds. Still, isn't it terrifying to think that if you get married, your chance of failure is 35%, and the chance of success is only 65% at the most? Even if we go with that number, isn't that still very, very scary? Isn't it high enough that it should dissuade anyone from attempting it? The answer to that question is no. And here's why. If the divorce rate is 35%, or even if it's 50%, it does not follow that your own particular marriage has a 35 or 50% chance of failure. Now, I'm not saying that you should be cocky or reckless, or that you should see yourself as invincible. I am saying that you shouldn't, on the other extreme, see yourself as passive debris floating helplessly on the tide of statistical likelihoods. Because you are an individual. Your marriage is an individual thing. And its chances of failure are not set by society at large. So here's an example to illustrate what I mean. And this is really, really important to understand because as marriage rates fall, and those are falling, the thing that convinces so many people to not marry in the first place are numbers like this. And this misconception that, well, look at the divorce rate, and that is my own specific chance of getting divorced. And I'm here to tell you that that's not how it works. Well, you know a company's looking out for you when they actually upgrade your service and don't charge you for it. This is great news for new and current Pure Talk customers. Pure Talk just added data to every plan and includes a mobile hotspot with no price increase whatsoever. If you've considered Pure Talk before, but you haven't made the switch, take a look again. For just $20 a month, you'll get unlimited talk, text, and now 50% more 5G data, plus their new mobile hotspot. That's why I love Pure Talk. They are veteran-owned. They only hire the best customer service team located right here in the great USA. Most families are saving almost $1,000 a year while enjoying the most dependable 5G network in America. Remember, you vote with how you spend your money, so stop supporting woke wireless companies that don't support you. When you go to puretalk.com/Walsh, you'll save an additional 50% off your first month because they actually value you. That's puretalk.com/Walsh. Pure Talk, wireless for Americans by Americans. So I think this illustrates it. The obesity rate in the United States is over 40%. Does that mean that your own chances of becoming obese are 40%? No, it doesn't. Your chances might be 5%. They might be practically zero, or they might be quite a bit higher than 40%. That's because obesity is the result of behavior and choices. If you do not engage in the behavior or make the choices that lead to obesity, you will not become obese. The fact that 40% of people around you are fat does not mean that you automatically have a 40% obesity risk. Now let's take another example. Car accidents. Americans get into car accidents at a certain rate. I'm not sure what the rate is. It doesn't matter for our purposes. What does matter is that your own individual chance of getting into a car accident is not the same as every other driver on the road. The people who compile statistics will say things like, motorists have an X% chance of getting into a collision. But you are not just a generic motorist. You are an individual. Now, you can never bring your own chance of dying in a fiery car wreck down to zero. But if you're a responsible driver, then obviously your chances of getting into an accident are much lower than the chances of someone who is not responsible. All of those stupid drivers who don't understand the basic rules of the road and like to tweet and eat while they drive and everything else, they're inflating the numbers for everyone. They're also making the roads more dangerous for everyone. They are actually actively making your own chances of getting into a car accident higher because the roads are filled with stupid people. But your chances are not as high as their chances. You do not share their level of risk unless you're as dumb as they are. Because again, you are an individual, not a mere statistic. So, what about marriage? It's true that even if you do everything right, things can still fall apart if your spouse doesn't follow that program. Now, if you both do everything right, or even most things right, then your chance of divorce is basically zero. But you could do everything on your end, and maybe your spouse doesn't do the same, and then it falls apart anyway, and that happens, and it's terrible, but it happens. It's also true that there are many, many things you can do in your marriage and before your marriage to make it much more secure than the average. Obvious things. Like you can marry someone who shares your same fundamental values. Not everyone does that. In fact, a lot of people don't. A lot of people go into marriages knowing ahead of time that they're marrying someone who doesn't share their fundamental values. Their chances of divorce are going to be somewhere much higher than yours if you don't make that basic entry-level mistake that they have made. You can do other things. Like you can state from the outset that you both in principle don't believe in divorce and won't consider it as a viable option for solving any marital difficulties you may experience down the line. You can have a strong and shared faith. You can establish from the beginning a habit of honest communication. You can make time for each other. You can continue to date, even or especially as your lives get busier and you start having kids and so on. You can make a strong effort to be patient with and grateful to each other. You can take care of your body and your appearance. You can do all these things and more. Now, I'm not saying that if you do all of this, it will bring your divorce chance down to zero. I'm not denying that there are plenty of people out there who did all this, at least on their own end, and yet still ended up divorced. That's not my point. My point is that the divorce rate doesn't take any of that into account. The people who take none of these basic steps are lumped in with the people who do all of it, And we're supposed to believe that both groups have an equal chance of marital failure. That's just not true. Now, I don't deny that there are real serious problems with marriage in our society. The so-called red pill people and others, they raise totally legitimate and important points on that end. We need drastic reform, abolish no-fault divorce. The entire family court system has to be torn down and rebuilt. The system is stacked against men in many ways that are extremely unfair and have ruined countless lives. So let's fight for those reforms, absolutely. But this systemic problem is not going to be solved today or tomorrow or next week. Abolishing no-fault divorce is just the beginning of reforming the system. Lawmakers in a small number of red states have only just started to seriously consider that idea, which is merely step one. So we're a long way off from fixing the system. It took decades to get us here. It will take decades to get us out at best. Anyone who tells you anything else is selling you something. They're selling you a bill of goods. This is a decade-long, long-term struggle. The question is, what are young men, young people in general, supposed to do in the meantime? And this is where the red pill becomes more of a hazy, foggy, ambiguous pill. They have no answer. They simply shout about reforms that are needed, yet have nothing to say to the young men in our culture today who will be old if not dead by the time the system is fixed, if it's ever fixed at all. What are these young men supposed to do right now? What kind of life would you have them lead right now, today? The answer, it appears, is that an entire generation of young men, if not multiple generations, should skip marriage while we wait for the system to improve. But this is not a viable solution. It's not a solution at all. It's a surrender. You're asking entire generations to give up their bloodline, their legacy, their chance of finding the transcendent joy and meaning that family life can provide. You're asking them to give up on themselves and on civilization itself. For thousands of years, human beings have always understood that their most basic purpose and obligation was to form families and have children. And yet you're telling these young men to ignore this calling and do what instead? Live for themselves alone, wasting away in front of screens? Only to die with no descendants, leaving no lasting mark on the world? Think about the kind of misery you're consigning these men to. Think about the catastrophic, probably fatal effect this would have on our country. You can't give up on propagating the species for a few decades and then pick it back up again like nothing happened. That doesn't work on any level, individually or societally. It is a recipe for despair and collapse. Am I saying that young men and women should accept the risk then and get married anyway? Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. That doesn't mean you should be reckless. I've already talked about many practical things you can do to mitigate your own risk so that it's not a roll of the dice. You should do all those things. Don't go into marriage blind, but don't run from it either. Even if you mitigate the risk to the extent possible, still there will be a risk. That's true, but here's the rub. All good things come with risk. The more worthwhile it is, the worse and more disastrous it will be if you fail. If you take on more responsibility, then your life will be more consequential, and the more consequential your life is, the more cataclysmic your failures potentially become. A married man with children lives a life of greater consequence than a single man with no children. There are more people depending on him. He has a greater stake in the future. This means that if things go sideways, it'll be a tragedy. If he screws up or his wife screws up or they both do, his life will be ruined, his children will be devastated, and the impact will reverberate down through the generations. This is what it means to live a high-impact, consequential life. These are the stakes. And yes, they are quite high. Now, sure, you can stave off that sort of catastrophe by staying by yourself, never going out on a limb, never taking any risk, never marrying, never having kids, never striving for anything great or meaningful in life. But then you're not avoiding failure and misery, you are guaranteeing it. You are ensuring that you never lose your family in a divorce by never having a family to lose in the first place, which is like ensuring that you never go bankrupt by being bankrupt to begin with. I'm not going to lose all my money because I'm going to stay broke. I beat the system. Not losing by having nothing to lose is a loss in itself. And I don't want that for anyone. It's not a path to happiness and prosperity for either you or society. It is a path to defeat, a preemptive and self-imposed defeat. And that is the worst kind of all. Hey, YouTube, thanks for listening to the show. If you'd like access to my full show with no ads, you should go to dailywire.com and use promo code Walsh to get 2 months free on all annual plans. See you there.